Hello and welcome to this apologies for that. We had some slight technical issues in actually setting up the stream today, and apologies for the short delay in actually getting everything online. But we are ready now, and I am delighted to welcome you to Orkney International Science Festival, both in person in Orkney and streaming online around the world. My name is Matt Vidmar. I'm a lecturer in engineering management at the University of Edinburgh, and it's my pleasure to be hosting today's event where we're talking about a new day for the ferryman. Orkney's ferries are aging. Those of you who have visited the Isles or live here will be undisputedly be sure of that fact. Could the new, more energy efficient ships, bridges, or even tunnels or causeways, or a mix of all of these be the solution for the future? Of course, for island and remote communities, these links are absolutely vital, not only to ensure the continuous economic development and prosperity of these islands, but also in general, survival of the communities over here. We are joined by two experts on the field, Professor Alf Baird and Roy Pedersen. Alfred was, prior to his retirement, Professor of Marine Business at Edinburgh Napier University, and also holds PhD in Strategic Management in Global Shipping. He has taught, researched, and published on a range of issues to do with management and government policy in shipping and seaports globally. This includes development and cost models, investigating the feasibility of shipping services and port infrastructure. Now, Roy has formerly pursued a career in economic, social, and cultural development with the Highlands and Islands Department Board and its successor, the Highlands and Islands Enterprise. He's proprietor of a consultancy business covering the diverse field of transport and cultural development and has served as a Highland councillor. He writes, publishes, speaks, and broadcasts on a variety of issues connected with development of New Scotland, of which, of course, transport is a very, very important part. Now, of course, we very much welcome your participation, dear audience, in this talk, especially questions that we'll try to take at the end. Slido, a tool that I'm sure you're already familiar with, can be used in order to submit questions, and I'll take as many of them as possible after the end of the talk. If you are not entirely sure where to find Slido, you go to slido.com, and then the code for entering this Orkney Science Festival feedback is 3435541. That's 3435541. So now, without much further ado, we are very, very excited about finding out what a new day is bringing for the ferryman in Orkney and beyond. Over to you, Alf.
Okay, thank you very much. I've just put on my presentation here, and I hope you can see that okay. And I'll put it on the, yeah, there we go. So what I have done here is to look at the optimal design for ferries, which Roy is looking more at the issues to do with fuel and different fuel types and other aspects of the system for transport. But what I wanted to do here was to look at the different vessel types, largely, that are available for small ferries for inter-island use, typically up to 100 meters length. And the key question, which I've found in the last 20, 30 years, has really been relating to how many hulls you want. Is it one hull, a monohull, or two hulls, a catamaran, or even in some cases 3 hulls, a trimaran? So these are the two options. What I would say is that traditionally users have specified monohulls, especially in Scotland, and much of Northern Europe, in fact, has been monohulls, one hull. Over the last 30 years, we've seen the rapid development of multi-hulls, particularly first in the high-speed craft sector, over 30 knots in some cases. Catamarans have done very well there, aluminium, light vessels. But now, over the last 20 years in particular, we've seen the development of a new type of vessel, the medium-speed steel hull catamaran. And these have significant advantages, as we know from the experience in Orkney of Pentland ferries and Pentalina, now also Alfred. So the subject I'm really going to cover here is split into a couple of different areas. First of all, looking at displacement, payload, and power of vessels, catamarans and monohull. Then looking at the efficiency and emissions of both ship types. Then the new build price and also the operating costs. Then what I call catamaran fallacies. This is arguments put forward by those who favor monohulls, traditional perspectives, which perhaps don't take into account the modern technology of medium speed steel hull catamarans. And finally, the important issue of safety. So if we go back to start with Archimedes' theory on displacement, we see that the displacement is the volume of water the hull moves aside. And a lot of this relates then to the power requirement and the capability of the ship, also the price and the type of, the amount of material that goes into the structure. So it's very important we get the displacement right. And this is where I start by looking at ferries in terms of the displacement. So here I think we see the small ferry, typically 40 meters length. The monohull would carry about 20 to 25 cars. And we see there a displacement of about 900 tons. If we compare to the catamaran, a 40-meter catamaran, its displacement is just over 300 tons. So it has a displacement of about 1/3. And if we then look at the power requirement for these vessels, the monohull has a power requirement 900 kilowatts, whereas the catamaran has a power requirement of 700, or about half actually per car space, because the 40-meter catamaran carries 50% more cars than the 40-meter monohull, 35 cars as opposed to 23 because of the wider beam. So there's a significant advantage of the catamaran in terms of displacement and power for small ferries. For medium-sized small ferry class, about 50, 60 cars, again, the monohull has a higher displacement of about 2,500 tons, and the catamaran is still under 1,000 tons, so about 1/3 the displacement. This power requirement then means that for the monohull, the power requirement of 5,000 kilowatts is more than twice the level of power required for the catamaran at 2,000 kilowatts. So for mid-size small ferry sector, 50, 60 cars capacity, 50-meter, 60-meter vessels, then the catamaran is also an attractive option. If we look at the 100-car capacity ferry, the monohull has a displacement of over 3,000 tons, and still the catamaran is below 1,000 tons, so about 1/3 the displacement. And this relates also to the power requirement for the monohull being double the catamaran, 6,000 kilowatts, as opposed to 3,000 kilowatts. So this is the evidence from research that catamarans, steel hull catamarans, for the same capacity, small ferries, 20 to 30 cars, mid-size, 50 to 60 cars, and larger 100-car capacity ferries, the catamaran provides a very good option. Well, the quick analysis here on the ship efficiency index, the numbers on the left just gives an index figure, but you can see there the catamarans have twice the efficiency of the monohulls for all ship sizes up to 100-car capacity. We can also look at this in terms of light ship, the displacement related to deadweight, what we call the revenue deadweight of the ship. And here we have on the left-hand side an example of a 75-car capacity catamaran with a deadweight of nearly 400 tons, displacement of 930 tons, and gives a revenue deadweight figure of 40%, whereas the comparable monohull is a deadweight of about 470 tons, bigger displacement, 2,300 tons, having a revenue deadweight of only 20%. This really means that you have to create much more ship to carry a given deadweight for the monohull, whereas there's much less volume of vessel required for the catamaran. Just to add there, I think a lot of this is to do with, as we'll cover later on, the ship draft, the ship, and the volume of ship that's actually in the sea. The catamaran has much less steel under the water, a shallower draft, whereas the monohull has much more volume of steel and tonnage in the water, including the need for ballast tanks to ensure stability, whereas the catamaran is already a stable platform, does not need ballast tanks. If we factor this into fuel consumption and emissions, this is, I think, for the 100-car capacity ship, you see the fuel consumption for the monohull nearly 1,000 liters per hour, where for the catamaran, it's under 450. And that works out in emissions for an annual operating service of about 3,000 operating hours per year for the vessel. That works out about half the emissions for the catamaran. So basically half the fuel consumption, half the emissions, and that's really a function of the displacement, if we go back to that, and the power requirement. If we look at the prices, this is going back to 2007, and many people here will be familiar with the Pentalina. And I did some research at the time for the Scottish Government and others, showing that the new vessel that CalMac were ordering at the time, the Finn Lagan for Islay, at a cost of nearly £25 million. The Pentalina was broadly the same size, but was acquired for £7 million. So I think I remember an article I wrote for the Iliach, the paper in Islay at the time, suggested that if you had chosen catamarans like Pentland ferries, you might have had 3 ferries instead of 1. And that would have overcome all the capacity problems on Islay at one go. Then more recently in 2012, we had the CalMac hybrid vessels. 3 or 4 vessels were ordered, 3 were built. The 23-car capacity, 43-meter long battery or hybrid powered monohull double ender for small islands like Rassi and others. These vessels were built with a large battery plant equivalent to a 20-foot container. So having to carry around a large heavy battery for their entire life was not ideal, and especially now with much lower weight batteries available. But even at the time, it was less efficient than a catamaran. We can see here and also the price of the catamaran was about 4 million. The 40-meter 35-car catamaran, which are in service in different parts of the world, compared to the CalMac small monohull of 11 million pounds. So the monohull was almost 3 times the price of the catamaran. So a much more beneficial outcome could have been obtained. And then as we get to more recently, the 2 vessels still building at Port Glasgow at Ferguson's, the hulls 801, 802, now called Glen Sannox and Glen Rosa. These are 100-car capacity vessels on the main deck. They had a new build price contracted at £50 million. The Alfred catamaran built for Pentland Ferries in Vietnam was contracted at the same time, 2015 and 16, I think, and was priced at 14.5 million. So about a third the price of these vessels. These vessels, as we know, are now, the cost has accelerated to quite enormous proportions, about 150 million pounds per vessel, 300 million pounds in total, which would have been sufficient, and I've pointed this out to successive transport ministers at Holyrood, it would have been sufficient to replace pretty much the entire CalMac fleet with catamarans for these 2 vessels. If we get to more recent times, the current order in Turkey for 4 CalMac monohulls costing £50 million each, the catamaran equivalent would have cost in Asia under 20 million, and building in Europe would have cost just over 20 million. So between 1/3 and a half the cost would have been the catamaran. So it's not the case that the monohulls are a good deal at all. And the question then remains, why is government and officials still ordering monohulls when they could be ordering lower cost catamarans? But that's not all the story. That's just the capital cost of buying a vessel. They have an operating cost, and they will operate for, or they're intended to operate for, more than 25 years. So here we have the operating costs, split capital, fuel, crew, and other costs. What we see here is the annual operating cost for a 100-car capacity monohull is about twice that of a comparable catamaran, £12 million as opposed to 6. So there's a saving every year of potentially £5 million or more. And if you work that out over 25 years for one single vessel, that's a saving of £125 million, which is a considerable saving. For CalMac's entire fleet, that's a saving of over £1 billion. That's in addition to the capital cost saving, although depreciation is included in this. The other aspect here is for smaller vessels, 25, 30-car capacity or 40, 50-car capacity, the operating cost savings are still significant, not quite the same level for the bigger vessel, but still significant, and certainly into the £1, £2 to £3 million a year. What does this tell us? It basically tells us that technology has moved on in the last 20, 30 years. Catamarans now becoming more popular. We see significant difference in displacement for the 100-car capacity catamaran. As we know, 1,000 tons for the multi-hull cat and 3,000 tons for the monohull. The displacement, that requires much more power plant in the monohull, and also ballast tanks, which adds hundreds of tons weight. More weight to carry around is not a good thing on a ferry. So that's the basic outcome there. Why do government agencies, officials, and even some private companies insist on buying monohulls? Well, there's a number of fallacies been raised over the years that even ministers have been told is the reason why Scottish ferry agencies have not been buying catamarans. And these include what I've called the reliability fallacy, seakeeping, ports, deadweight, cabins, and also regulations. So if we go to the first one, the reliability fallacy, we know from experience here and around the world that the medium speed steel hull catamaran can provide a year-round, safe, reliable service, including in severe weather conditions as well. And there's an example here of cancellations of monohulls in early 2020, whereas the catamaran was operating. But essentially what we find with the research into the different types of ships is that the catamaran has significant advantages in adverse weather. The first one is a much lower windage. The windage of a catamaran is about half that of a monohull. The catamaran has 4 engines, which aids redundancy. Instead of the monohull usually has 2 engines, whereas the catamaran has 4, 2 in each hull. The catamaran has 4 propellers, which also aids maneuverability and allows the small vessel to turn in confined harbour spaces and also shallow draft harbours. And we know from long-term experience that the catamaran has worked really well on the Pentland Firth, which is comparable really to any of the worst sea routes in Scotland. So the catamaran in this sense has proven itself as equal to or superior in some cases to the monohull. And this is a study by Strathclyde showing the windage area and the effect. So here we see the catamaran is quite low in terms of the windage area, about half the windage of a monohull. So the silhouette of the ship is very important here. Also the issue to do with damage stability, which I'll come on to in a minute as well, because Strathclyde also studied that in some detail. The other fallacy here is the seakeeping. Catamarans historically in Europe were considered to be less comfortable than monohulls. That was really relating to high-speed vessels, aluminium, lightweight, high-speed vessels that maybe are more uncomfortable. But the medium-speed steel hull vessel is a completely different vehicle and classed under a different IMO classification as well, the same as monohulls. So the catamaran advantages are at sea, shorter roll period because of the wider beam, a lower block efficient, so less slamming and pitching compared to the monohull, much less of the vessel in the sea, much shallower draft. This also leads to less speed loss in rough seas, so the catamaran can maintain a good speed even in rough seas, whereas the monohull less so. And also there is an issue about survivability, and the key issue here is the 2 hulls as opposed to 1 hull, which gives added stability and survivability. The port fallacy is another issue. Some people saying that catamarans can't use existing ports. They do have some difficulty occasionally using existing very narrow link spans, but can be adjusted with split stern ramps to do that, to berth either to port or starboard piers. This can be done, but there is a general movement towards wider ramps, which enables any catamaran to be used. The cost savings are of such scale that modifications to ports are relatively insignificant. And also the catamaran saves money on port investment. It has lower port infrastructure costs because there's not the same need to dredge deeper berths alongside. The catamaran has 1/3 less draft than the monohull. And also the catamaran is a shorter length vessel, maybe 20% less length, so it doesn't need such a long pier. So usually there are considerable savings in pier costs for catamarans. The deadweight fallacy, that's the argument that catamarans might not be able to carry enough freight. Well, the reality is that ferries tend to max out on the car deck space, not necessarily the deadweight. The catamaran provides required trailer and car capacity for any route. The wider beam of the catamaran provides 2 or 3 added lanes of car space. So 6 or 7 car lanes on a catamaran compared to maybe 2, 3, or 4 on a monohull provides a lot more capacity for a given power requirement. And cabins is another argument that certainly on the CalMac network, the RMT and others have argued that we need lots of cabins on vessels for 1 hour, 2 hour crossings, which really most routes around the world that have 1 or 2 hour crossings have proved they don't need cabins. Overnight routes are a different story, but most short range inter-island routes don't require large scale cabin accommodation for large crews either. Crews can live ashore and do tend to live ashore, even in Orkney, live on the islands, and this is done around the world as well. Catamarans do provide a few cabins for dry docking, for delivery voyages, for repositioning, and that's a normal. But the live on board for 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off is pretty much a CalMac tradition, going back to the old steamer days. It's not necessarily a key requirement nowadays. And also the regulations. The catamarans, of course, must meet all the regulations that the monohull must meet, whether it's IMO, class, Lloyd's Register, or whatever, and the MCA to get the certificates required to operate. They must be compliant, they must be classified, and they must be deemed safe. And that's the last point here, and I will cover on safety. But before that, I would just mention that the charter of Pentland Ferries Alfred to CalMac this summer has went very successfully. But what it really does demonstrate is there was no requirement to build £50 million monohulls, which are now costing £150 million, which for one of these vessels wouldn't have been sufficient to buy and build 10 Alfreds, which is ridiculous. It doesn't make business sense. It doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make any sense. It's just a ridiculously poor decision. But the problem is the officials who made these decisions are largely still in place, making more of the same decisions. And the question which will come up in Orkney and also Shetland to some extent is for fleet replacement, which is now overdue, certainly in Orkney, any tenders should include catamarans. Absolutely, they must include catamarans. If they exclude catamarans, they will just be incurring considerably more cost and also emissions likely. On the safety issues, this study by Strathclyde by Professor Vassalos and Dr. Pedersen last year showed that catamarans, monohulls are heavier, and then catamarans have a deeper draft, which adds to safety risk. The lower windage profile of the catamaran is considered a major advantage, and also reducing the rolling motion, as well as enabling berthing in high winds. But the catamaran for sure has a 48% lower lightweight deadweight ratio, and also has enormous margins of stability compared to monohull, 24 times the average monohull design, according to the research. This also means that the catamaran achieved what's called an attained index on stability of 0.939, which is exceedingly high, higher than any monohull. And also the catamaran's PLL, potential loss of life, was calculated at 82% less than that of an average monohull design. Further studies are ongoing with the catamaran to add foam insulation to make it even more safer, virtually unsinkable vessel. And this is just an idea of where the foam goes in the forepeak and at the stern, and also in the bottom of the vessel, and above the. And this enables an additional car deck to on the larger catamarans to an additional car deck to be placed underneath the main deck along each side hull, providing a 50% increase in capacity as well. So it produces a virtually unsinkable ship. The as this is a relatively new technology over the last 25, 30 years, there's been a lot of new operators of these types of medium speed catamarans, and these are just some of them around the world. The key issue here to note is that once an operator moves to catamarans, like Pentland Ferries did after operating 2 CalMac monohulls initially, once they move to catamarans, they never go back to monohulls. And there's no reason why they should, because the costs are at least twice as much to buy, twice as much to operate or more, plus higher emissions, higher port costs, and so on. But just to summarize the presentation, what we see with this research is for sure lower capital costs with the catamaran, much lower operating costs, reduced build time as well. The monohulls that CMAL have been building typically take between 3 and 4 years to build, and the current vessels at Port Glasgow are taking even longer, whereas the catamarans are produced in half that time. And that's largely a function of their proven designs. What we see with CalMac and local authorities building monohull ferries is they tend to design their own prototypes, their own concepts, and they add in quite a lot of weight to them. They don't necessarily have an efficient hull form, whereas the catamarans are proven designs. There's 2 or 3 catamaran designers that have proven designs, and it's possible to take these on and to buy them and to get them delivered relatively quickly, just like you would with a new car. They have lower emissions, and as I've covered previously in presentations here, and I think Roy will cover, there's a range of different fuel consumption options that are available or may be available depending on fueling arrangements locally. That includes hybrid options, also solar panels, sails, moving towards methanol, ammonia, hydrogen. There's different options. But at the moment, the best option is probably going to be a hybrid, but with the capability to change later on with these vessels. It's the catamaran is found in the research to be the safest ferry, can use existing piers with minor adjustments, and also new piers would be much cheaper than with monohulls. And here in Orkney, there's the requirement to redevelop piers, and these findings would suggest that piers should be redeveloped to take account of catamarans. Catamarans are also compliant with regulations. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I believe we're handing off to Roy as soon as the slides get set up. In the meantime, I'll just remind everyone, if you do have any questions, I've already seen quite a number of questions popping up on Slido, but if anybody is still figuring out how to get there, remember you can just go to slido.com and then enter this number into your session number, and that is 3435541. Okay, so it's 3435541. But I believe we are nearly ready as soon as those odd shaped rectangles disappear from the screen to hand over to Roy.
Right.
Now, okay, I think that's better.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry not to be with you in person today, but it's great to be with you online. After Alf's excellent and thought-provoking presentation, showing the clear superiority of catamarans over monohulls for, well, I would say most, if not all, ferry situations in Scotland. I'm going to look at maybe how we can take this forward closer to net zero. So that's really the theme of my presentation. So next slide, please. Now, a bit of nostalgia. The first time I was ever in Orkney, I think it was 1960, a long time ago. And I went in the old St. Magnus, almost at the end of her career. That's her behind the pier. And the purpose of my visit, I'd fallen in love in Aberdeen with this small ship that I saw in for dry docking in Aberdeen, Earl Sigurd. That's the old Earl Sigurd, built in the early 1930s. lovely old ship, but the government at the time, the Scottish, well, it wasn't the Scottish government, but the Scottish office at that time was looking at travel to the North Isles of Orkney, and they concluded that there was little demand for travel to the North Isles and little potential for tourism. Of course, when you think about it, the ships left, Earl Sigurd Ealdorfen would leave Kirkwall at about 6 o'clock in the morning, call at Ede, Sandy, Stronsay, head up Calf Sound, Papawestry, Pirrawall, Westray, spend the night there and come back the next day, starting very early in the morning, which is not a terribly convenient way for passengers to travel. It's handy for freight at the time. With little vision on the part of the officials in the Scottish office, which does tend to be a feature that exists today, they presumed that because nobody travelled in this highly inconvenient service, then they wouldn't wish to travel in future, until Chris Marrow came along with Golden Mariana, and he set up a service running in the mornings to the islands and back, and then running in the afternoons to the islands and back. And suddenly, not only did islanders want to go to Kirkwall to do a bit of shopping or other business or even leisure or whatever, and get back the same day, but visitors could go to the islands and get back the same day. Suddenly, people did want to travel to the North Isles and from the North Isles. So next slide, please. Around that time, the Norwegian local authority of Møre og Romsdal, they did a really detailed analysis of ferry connections. What's the ideal system? And they came up with a formula, which is make the ferries part of the road system, use the shortest crossing possible, make them frequent, simple ships, minimal crewing, crew live ashore, as Alf was indicating, lock on link spans, rather than the ship's ramp going down onto the link span. Lock-on means there's no shore crew necessary to operate them. And then land passengers over the link span rather than over the side. So next slide, please. And around that time, a few years later, the question of the Pentland Firth arose, and there were two schools of thought. At that time, it was a lift-on, lift-off service with the old Centola. She left Stromness in the morning to Scrabster, discharged her cargo of cars very often by lifting them on off a derrick, and then loading again with a new lot of cars and other cargo and going back to Stromness in the afternoon. Again, it wasn't possible in those days to leave Orkney to the Scottish mainland and do any kind of business and get back the same day. The alternative that was considered was a service across the shortest crossing from Gills Bay to Berwick in the south end of South Ronaldsay, because by then the Churchill barriers had been created and it was possible to drive from there to any other part of the Orkney mainland. So the debate continued. It was suggested by the council at that time that the Pentland Firth was not suitable for roll-on, roll-off ferries and that the new vessel should be lift-on, lift-off. However, roll-on, roll-off did come on with P&O ferries operating the new Centola. In fact, a series of new Centolas running between Stromness and Scrabster to the old schedule. So it still wasn't possible to get to the mainland and the Scottish mainland and back in one day until Pentland ferries came on the scene. And Pentland ferries started with the Pentalina B, a former Calmac ferry running between Gills Bay and St Margaret's Hope. And for the first time, it was a frequent service, and it was possible to get off Orkney, do business on the Scottish mainland, and get back the same day. It was also much easier for visitors to get to Orkney, and the service continued to flourish. Now, the ideal route would be into Berwick, but so far the Orkney Islands Council has not been inclined to allow Pentland ferries into Berwick. That would, of course, shorten the distance further and allow for a more frequent and cheaper service. Next slide, please. Just to show the difference in operating costs and fuel use between the new Pentalina, well, the then new Pentalina and Ham na Vo. They operated now by Northlink. They were moving on to the kind of present operation. Pentalina, of course, is a catamaran, as Alf has illustrated, with its many advantages. So, and Ham na Vo, which was built around the same time as Pentalina, Ham na Vo cost £28 million. Pentalina cost £7 million. Pentalina, in her multiple journeys across the Pentland Firth, uses 710 tonnes of fuel per year. Ham na Vo, 4,000 tonnes of fuel per year, and the subsidy for Pentalina is nil. Subsidy for Ham na Vo is around £9 million a year. So that basically is the Pentalina is operating for a fraction of the cost and emitting a fraction of the emissions compared with the long route from used by Ham na Vo. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at CO2 emissions, 87% of all human-produced emissions in the planet come from the burning of fossil fuels, coal, gas, oil. Much of that is involved in transport or space heating. So when we think of aircraft, when we think of ships moving containers, when we think of transport in general, cars, we almost all use cars. That's sticking CO2 into the atmosphere. But the point, I suppose, that isn't stressed is that it's not so much that we're doing this, but more and more of us are doing this in the planet. And only in 1974, there were 4 billion people living on planet Earth. Now there are twice that. There are 8 million people living on planet Earth. If we go back a bit further to the 1930s, there were only 2 billion. So the population in less than a century has increased fourfold. So there are 4 times as many people burning carbon dioxide as there were 100 years ago. So that's an issue that, well, is food for thought. What the solutions are is not for me to say, but clearly there is a limit to the size of the population that our planet can sustain. Next slide, please. So the carbon footprint of well, any transport mode really, but considering ferries, 1 tonne of diesel is just over 1,000 litres, and 1 litre of diesel equals 2.6 kilograms of CO2. 1 megawatt of power equates to 220 litres per hour. And that's about 0.58 of a tonne per hour of CO2 emitted. Now, Pentalina, just over 2,000 tonnes of CO2 per year, and that route is now carrying the bulk of the traffic, both commercial vehicles, cars, and passengers across the Pentland Firth. Ham na Vo, 13,000 tonnes of CO2 per year, and carrying less traffic than Pentalina. Next slide, please. So the solutions as regards ferries, well, efficient vessel design, and Alf took us through the best option really for that in providing a good payload for minimal fuel consumption. Then minimise the passage time and maximise the frequency by selecting the shortest possible route, and favour innovative operators. And there seems to be a tendency among official bodies in Scotland to be almost frightened of innovative operators. is challenging the status quo seems to be something that in Scotland is to be feared, whereas in many other countries, Scandinavia, the United States, Canada, Australia, innovation is welcomed. So if you think about it, if we had, say, a two-ship hourly Gills Bay to Berwick service running from, say, 6 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, just think of how that would improve Orkney's connectivity, and it could be done at relatively low cost and with relatively few emissions of CO2, or in the longer term, fixed links. Next slide, please. Now, in Norway, for the last 20 or 30 years, has been busy boring tunnels where ferries formerly existed, or boring them through mountains all over the place. And likewise, so have the Faroe Islands, that archipelago of not dissimilar size, just some hundreds of miles to the northwest of Orkney. Faroe Islands has 17 tunnels linking its various islands, one of which, more or less in the middle of the slide, has a roundabout in the middle of the tunnel, deep under the sea. Now, if we try to visualize how that might work in Orkney, first of all, the Pentland Firth ought not to be an insurmountable challenge for a tunnel. I mean, I am not an expert in the geology, but it's no longer than many of the tunnels in Orkney. So if we had a tunnel across the Pentland Firth from John O'Groats approximately to South Ronaldsay, then you have a road link via the Churchill barriers into Orkney mainland. You then have a tunnel come causeway to Shapinsay, tunnel to Ede with links to Sandy and Stronsay, and then over ferry to Westray, and then a causeway to Papa Westray. Use causeways where it's shallow and tunnels where it's deeper. Then on a southern route, if the key link between Flotta, say, and Hoy generally, and the outside world would then be to South Ronaldsay, because that would link with the mainland, the Scottish mainland connection, and then a link across via the north end to North Ronaldsay and Grahamsay, giving you a circuit. So that would be from the south to Stromness. You would go via South Ronaldsay across to Flotta and westward and over to Stromness. For the other North Isles, then you're talking about the links that I've shown on the map. Now, how feasible all this is, not for me to say, but that's a kind of vision of what might be possible. And I suggest if Orkney were part of Norway, then perhaps that's the sort of system that might have been developed had that been the case. So next slide, please. Looking at longer distance open water solutions, it's interesting to compare the service to Lofoten in the north of Norway, well north of the Arctic Circle, way out in the open Atlantic. We have ferries operating there of the Landegoed class, 120 cars, 18 knots, 12 crew, 5,000 kilowatts, 5 megawatts. Compare that with Hamnavoe with 95 cars, 28 crew, and 8 megawatts. So getting on for twice the power for somewhat less cars, requiring over twice the crew. It does suggest that there's an economic way of doing these things and an uneconomic way of doing them, and the options there are in front of you. Next slide, please. Now, applying that Lofoten formula It seems to me that Shetland, of course, is linked mainly to Aberdeen by sea. It's a long and exposed sea passage. I guess it's the kind of main line between Orkney and Shetland. It's an overnight crossing. It's expensive because if you want some comfort, you need a cabin, and that's going to be expensive. If you've got to say a family of 4 in a car, it costs quite a lot of money to go on holiday. So what it struck me was using a Landigo type vessel, and these ships are going to be replaced in the near future between the most southern point of Shetland, Grootness, which is just adjacent to Sunborough Airport, and a link to Kirkwall, starting in Shetland in the morning and going back in the afternoon. That would enable you to get from Shetland to any part of the Scottish mainland in daylight. I suppose you could say that would be a summer-only service, perhaps, at least to start with, but it seems to me something that could be done relatively inexpensively, and it would revolutionise at least seasonal access to Shetland. That would be augmented ideally by a frequent Gills Bay to Berwick ferry service, an hourly service, as I suggested earlier. So next slide, please. Now, other options in Iceland, the Vestmannaeyjar Islands are served by the ferry Herjolfur, and this ship is operated by batteries. In favourable conditions, the batteries are used throughout. On other occasions, supplemented by diesel engines, but certainly very, very much reduced CO2 emissions or no CO2 emissions at all. So that's an interesting, and also silent operation, an interesting example. And as you can see, she's a pretty good seaboat as well, and has to be. Next slide, please. Now, this is a very, very strange case. Alf mentioned the hybrid ferries that Seamal Calmac introduced in relatively recent years. By hybrid, that means they're propelled by electric motors using batteries, but augmented by diesel engines. And they cost 12 million each, 23 cars, 9 knots. And the curious thing is that the diesel consumed per car space per hour is almost 4 litres per hour per car space. Western Ferry's Sound of Seal, which carries almost twice as many cars, was built for 1/3 of the cost and has about a half the diesel per car space per hour. And she's just a pure diesel boat. So it's a curious thing that the supposed new technology of heading towards net zero is actually a worse performer than a more traditional but very efficient diesel ferry. Why? Well, I guess the reason is that because the ship has got heavy batteries, she's deeper in the water. There's more to propel through the water, and then the batteries are only used for half the time because she doesn't recharge between journeys. She just charges up at night, and then the batteries run flat halfway through the day, and diesel engines are used for the rest of the day. So not a very efficient system. And it does seem that £12 million is a rather excessive price to pay for something that's not functioning as well as a conventional vessel. Next slide, please. Now, this was my grandfather's most notable ship, Lancing. You might like to look her up when this is over, Lancing. But not a lot of emissions there in her ocean-going voyages. I suppose there'll be a certain amount of CO2 from the galley chimney, but otherwise, at the breadths of the 28 sailors who sailed her, less than on a typical Calmac ferry. But that is the past answer to CO2, and is there a future for that? Well, next slide, please. As Alf mentioned briefly, the Norwegians in particular are looking at hybrid vessels using sails where sails are appropriate. This design, and this is for the ferries, the Hurtigruten ferries that run right up the Norwegian coast. The sails would be retractable, would be used when the wind was favourable, and use solar panels as well, so greatly reducing the energy required and, of course, the emissions. So electric vessels using this sort of technology to augment the battery charges. Or next slide. This is more or less current technology, experimental, but sails on conventional cargo vessels, vast cargo vessels, which in favourable conditions can reduce the amount of fuel required to propel the ship. So maybe the day of the sailing ship is coming back in new forms. Next slide, please. Now, batteries. I have long been a bit suspicious of battery technologies, the great things, and very useful in all sorts of circumstances. But on vehicles and on ships, they suffer from limited range and also limited battery life. They're expensive items and they don't last all that long. But another issue is that the cobalt required is mined in near slave-like conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the source of the material to make the batteries is of questionable origin. Then there's the question of fire and explosion risk from lithium-ion batteries and what's called thermal runaway. And this is such a concern that the Norwegian authorities are concerned about considering banning electric vehicles from ferries. And electric vehicles are very common in Norway. They're much more used there than here. And the reason for the concern is, of course, thermal runaway. If you get a fire from these batteries, it's very, very difficult to put out. And so it's not a handy thing if you have a whole car deck of these vessels, of these vehicles on the vessel. That is quite a hazard. So the batteries, I'm not sure that in the long run they are the solution for net zero. So next slide, please. It seems to me that to overcome those problems, that the green hydrogen, seems like the answer to almost all of these issues. The emission from hydrogen, as we know, is water vapor, H2O. But hydrogen combines with oxygen in being used as a fuel, and water vapor is the emission, which ends up back in the sea from whence it came. It's not yet a commercially economic, really, but the way to produce it, it seems to me, is electrolyzing water. That's water's H2O, so you take out the H2 and you capture that for future usage as a fuel. You need a lot of electricity to do that. And what puzzles me is that tidal stream generation, of which there is a perfect example in the Pentland Firth, which most of you will be familiar with, we never hear it mentioned in the news as being an option for the future. And yet, tidal stream generation, the tide is predictable. There's tidal streams going on around our coasts all the time. If it's not running in the Pentland Firth, it's running in the Sound of Slate off Skye. So if you have tidal stream generators linked up to the grid, then you've got a base load. The current will be running all the time. At neap tides, that's your base load. So if we can generate that base load from tidal stream energy, then why don't we use the intermittent energy from wind generation, which would then be basically it's energy that's not otherwise required, so should be cheap for electrolyzing water to generate hydrogen. That would be a kind of the solution that I would think would be worth exploring. Next slide, please. Now, hydrogen power options, fuel cell is very much an option for the future. Hydrogen into fuel cells for electric motive power can be used direct in internal combustion engines or turbine engines, or even in boilers. And I suppose we're talking about horses for courses. One innovation is the hydrogen-powered Aquarius lightweight two-sided free-piston linear engine under development in Israel, and it seems to me something worth looking at for the future. Next slide, please. Now, trucks. We need trucks. We can't do without them. That's how we get our goods delivered. The universal means of land transport. Only 1.5% of road users, but 20% of the emissions. So hydrogen vehicles would seem to be an ideal solution. And this Glasgow-based company has developed H2 fuel cell electric HGVs, and it combines zero CO2 and artificial intelligence to optimize the fuel requirement. And as lorries go, it's a pretty good looking vehicle. Next slide, please. This is happening. The Norwegians on the Lofoten service, 3.5 hours out into the Atlantic to the Lofoten Islands. They're developing pure hydrogen ferries, and we'll see that by 2025, 2 years away, which of course means that some of the existing ferries might be available for the kind of uses I was suggesting earlier on. Next slide, please. Aviation. Now that's the kind of bugbear of the environmentalists, and the vapor trails that we see up there in the sky. I think that's not so good. A lot of CO2 and other stuff being turfed out of the planes there. Well, Airbus is working on hybrid hydrogen aircraft, and they expect to have propulsion system proven hopefully by 2025, 2 years away, and a commercial application by 2035. Next slide and last slide. So my suggestion is we aim high. Apparently, and I can't vouch for it, but apparently Michelangelo said the greatest danger is not that we aim too high and we miss it, but that we aim too low and achieve it. So that's my message for today, and thanks very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Roy and Alf. I think you can both join me on screen now. Thank you so much for a very informative and very wide-ranging presentation. I think we don't have too much time for questions, so I'll try to basically combine some of the questions we received online via Slido, and then and see how we go with that. I think there's one very quick one for Alf to debunk another one of those myths. So it is argued sometimes that there can be less machinery space on a catamaran. So I'm sure that one can be similarly debunked as the other ones in terms of lorry space.
Well, I just say I've been in the engine rooms of monohulls and catamarans, and the fact is that the catamaran has a requirement for smaller engines. So you don't need as big an engine room on a catamaran typically, not a medium speed catamaran anyway, not compared to a high speed one. So the catamaran is pretty good in that respect. The other advantage of the catamarans that we see, and I think Pentland Ferries experience is where the engines are positioned at the stern. They're accessible pretty easily, and they can be changed very rapidly, including within a day or less, within a few hours even. So I think the engine the engine room is not a problem for a catamaran. It's a big advantage, I would say.
And another one of those myths that's cropped up, which is to do with how much it would cost to adapt the current pier infrastructure to load cats instead of monohulls.
Yeah, I think what we've seen in the demonstration on the west coast with the charter of the Alfred is it's been fairly easy to access all the many of the existing piers that have wider ramps. So where we already in Orkney are seeing some of the ramps being widened, and some of the main piers in say Kirkwall have wider ramps. So that should be a normal process. But as I said in the presentation, where you're investing in new piers, as Orkney is, and the west coast too, it's much less expensive to build a pier for a catamaran than a monohull, because you don't have to deepen so much into the seabed. You don't have to dredge so much or at all, and you don't need the same length of pier. So they can be modified and cheaper for catamarans. And also the catamaran can have a split ramp at the stern. I think Roy's also studied this before, where you can split the long ramp into two, so that the catamaran can berth either to a port pier or a starboard pier.
We have a slightly tricky one, probably for you, Roy. What do you think is more likely, a bridge to Northern Ireland or tunnels connecting the Orkney Isles?
Well, who knows? I'm not a clairvoyant, but I would guess a tunnel to Orkney is probably an easier proposition than a bridge tunnel, whatever it is, to Northern Ireland and crossing the Beaufort Dyke, which is full of munitions. So I would go for Orkney, but it's a while away yet, I guess.
I guess both of them quite challenging projects nonetheless. So I think final question, which I think it cuts to the to the heart of this, right? I mean, you've prepared a very persuasive case, of course, for the catamarans and for a more diverse infrastructure, transport infrastructure onto the islands and across the islands. We've noticed on the hand, of course, the very much lack of a political will to move in this direction. You mentioned tradition in terms of, for instance, how Calmac operate their fleet is being one of the roadblocks. But is there any way, on the basis of this relatively overwhelming scientific opinion, for the public to get involved and exert pressure onto the powers that be in order to actually have a wider range of these options on the table and not being dismissed offhand as they have been in the past?
Well, I don't know if you want me to speak about that. Yeah,
please
I think
do.
So. This presentation, and especially as regards catamarans, Alf's part of the presentation, I think a number of people have seen it today. It's been broadcast. I think it should be broadcast more widely, and it is for the public to put pressure on the Scottish government to overcome this. I don't know what the word is, just a antipathy almost towards more efficient and modern ways of doing things. Innovation seems to be, it seems to frighten them. And I think they've got to be jolted out of that fear. And public pressure is one way of doing it, probably maybe the best way of doing it.
Yeah, I would add that Roy's done a lot of work on community ownership. And what we've found in some of the islands on the west coast is there's a real desire now to have community involvement in the ferry operations and community decision making, because central government has not been successful at this and has made the wrong procurement decisions, as we see. It's not just, I think, tradition. It's. I think somebody once considered it almost pathological in the desire to have traditional monohulls rather than catamarans. But as I said in my presentation, the catamarans are a relatively new phenomenon in Northern Europe in the last 30 years. First in the high-speed technology, and now in the medium speed. And the medium speed concept was actually developed by a Scotsman in Asia, in Australia, Stuart Ballantyne. And he is the developer and innovator and designer of that vessel class. And that has now been sold to more than 40 countries. So what we're talking about is a relatively new concept, which as we see in Orkney with Pentland ferries, they have maximized the use of this and developed a very, very efficient business model from that. And now it's being seen on the West Coast with the charter of the Alfred to the CalMax system, showing beyond doubt that the catamaran can provide a very valid alternative at much lower cost than monohulls. So I think there is a movement already, a momentum build up. It's taken us a long time to get to this stage, but I think the island communities now are wanting catamarans, and that I think is without a doubt certainly on the West Coast now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Roy, now for sorry. You want to say something, Roy?
Could I just say, to add to Alf, he said in the West Coast, I think for the Orkney North Isles as well, catamarans would be absolutely ideal for the Orkney North and South Isles fleet replacement.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both of you. So much food for thought in such a pertinent discussion, as I say, especially with the commissioning or the procurement of the new vessels underway. So thank you so much also to our audience joining us online and in person. If you can, please fill out one of those feedback forms. And of course, you can join us as well in just 15 minutes for the Imagineering Opportunities, the next in this year's Orkney International Science Festival's events. But for now, thank you so much and have a lovely rest of the afternoon.
All the best.